Hi everybody, I wanted to introduce you to our first slide that we were looking at in terms of vascularization of the brain. So what we're going to be talking about is basically what are the blood inputs and outputs that are feeding into the brain. Or more eloquently put, how is it that these different areas of the arterial and how it system feeds into the brain and supplies in multiple different regions of the brain, and then how is it that the actual venous system is actually able to help get rid of the waste that's the metabolic waste that's created by the brain's activity. So what we're looking at in this first image here is basically this brachiocephalic trunk that arises from the aorta and feeds into the common carotid in this branch here, and then also this vertebral artery here. So we'll follow up the common carotid artery here and see how it feeds into both the external and internal carotid. In particular, we're interested in that internal carotid, and then how that feeds that then feeds into into this central or cerebral arterial circle here. So there's multiple different arteries that arise from that and that feed into that. We'll talk about it for this point. But the major thing that I want you to try to appreciate is that this is feeding into more of that middle and anterior portions of the brain and giving supply into that type of area. The vertebral artery that we're looking at here is feeding into that more of the posterior parts. We'll learn more about how that is actually, there's some compensatory activity of the arterial system to be able to allow to cover in case there's some blockage of one or the other arteries. But you can see that it's organized so that it's actually more posterior, feeds into there, into the basilar artery, and then it's much more readily able to actually perfuse some of the posterior portions of the brain. So now that we have sort of that in front and back regions of the brain here, let's take a look then at another perspective that gives us some insight into this, into these systems and how they work. So this is the cerebral arterial circle, and the Circle of Willis, another great band name, if you will. But this Circle of Willis that's being described right here in this central or cerebral arterial circle, we hinted at right up here. So that's that Circle of Willis kind of being depicted in this perspective here. So it gets fed by multiple different types of arteries supplying it. And that's useful when we want to think about how we have redundancy into the perfusion of the brain. So, okay, we have this internal carotid that we talked about before that feeds into this Circle of Willis. Let's go back a slide and take a look at that. Here's that internal carotid, which is rising right here, and then it feeds into this central cerebral arterial circle here. Okay, so that's where it is here. It's feeding in, and from this perspective, when we're looking sort of up at the brain, then we can see how it kind of tucks in there and is able to supply some arterial system there. The basilar artery and the vertebral artery are shown here. So here's that vertebral artery that fed up and that snaked up from the brachiocephalic trunk from the previous slide, and now it's coming up and then feeding into the basilar artery and then into this central arterial circle here. So this is one of the ways that we can actually be able to appreciate what we have coming up in here. So this internal carotid is really an important type of being able to help supply blood vessels here. And so if you have any blockage that happens in the internal carotid or in the vertebral artery for that matter, you can see that there could be a real potential for damage and hypoperfusion, at least, that could happen in these different regions. So in this case, when we're looking at sort of this arthroectomy, what we're doing is that we're trying to rectify the loss of some of these different the blockage that you can have in the carotid, for example. So let's take a look at this kind of idea of what the carotid endarthectomy is. So what you basically have found is that in that carotid artery here, there's been a buildup of plaques, and basically what they do is they basically clamp off the two sides here and then pull out the plaque and where they think that's actually happening. And that helps reduce the hypoperfusion that can sometimes happen in this part and feeding the brain. So if we look at these different regions and how they work, this diagram here is really useful for being able to track how things kind of move through here. And we'll begin down here talking about this vertebral artery and how it's feeding into this, what we call this posterior circulation. And a lot of this we'll be talking about posterior versus anterior circulation, and that's meaningful because we want to think about, when we have occlusions, how that impacts the viability of the brain there. So what we're seeing here is that we have this vertebral artery coming in and feeding into these regions that ultimately then supplies this basilar artery that I was talking about here. And then that basilar artery is then able to help supply the posterior cerebral artery. And I'm ignoring some of these parts here, where we talk about the cerebellar part. We'll come back to those in a little bit. But I just want to kind of focus in on how we're kind of supplying blood to the cerebrum itself. And so this is going and feeding into that posterior part of the cerebrum. The middle cerebral artery that we have here is one that helps to feed in. So the internal carotid comes in, feeds into this middle cerebral artery here, and supplies the left and the right sides of it. And then ultimately then we see this then feeds into these anterior cerebral arteries here, and helps supply that. So in between these, then we have these communicating arteries that we have in here. Anterior communicating artery here, and then we have the posterior communicating arteries here. So that helps to create this circle that's been supplied by both the posterior circulation that we see here, and then the anterior circulation that was supplied by the internal carotid and feeding into these middle cerebral arteries. So if we look at a real picture of this, then what we're taking away from this is that we have we can see this depiction of the vertebral artery feeding into here, into the basilar artery, that ultimately then feeds into this circle. It's hard to see the circle here, but you can kind of see it tucked around. And then here's the optic chiasm with the optic nerves here, and here's that internal carotid kind of sticking out there. So that's what we're looking at when we're seeing this kind of blood supply here. You can see these branches off here that we'll talk about and how important they are for feeding the cerebellum. But we can also note here, as this basilar artery is feeding into, it feeds into this posterior cerebral artery that is right here. And if you're into it, and we'll talk about these cranial nerves later, but you see how they're kind of tucked around the oculomotor nerve, as well as the trigeminal nerve down here. So very interesting types of organization that we have. So okay, then that's great. We'll come back to this picture and then start filling it in. Again, we're looking at that the posterior circulation feeding to the basal artery, posterior cerebral artery, all of this kind of repeating, anterior circulation here, and that communication. But the part I want to kind of draw your attention to is the superior cerebellar arteries, anterior cerebellar arteries, and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or PICA here, and as one term it's used to help describe it. So these types of arteries are important for supplying some of the brainstem and the cerebellar portions of the brain, and are quite important there. So we can see the actual pictures of like the superior cerebellar arteries is shown right here. The anterior cerebellar artery is shown right here. And so these are being fed by this basilar artery that we have. So vertebral arteries coming in, feeding into basilar, and then that's supplying a lot of this input for the arterial circulation of the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. And then we can see kind of tucked back in here is that posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So that gives us an idea of where these things are. Let's take a look at the cerebellar circulation and see what happens when we actually start to mess with it. So as we look here and we look at these different types of cerebellar arteries, looking from a side view here, then what we're seeing from this lateral perspective is that we have these superior cerebellar arteries feeding in and supplying this portion of the cerebellum. So if you block here, you'll lose and you'll see infarcts that occur in this particular region of the cerebellum, or the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which feeds into this posterior portion of the cerebellum here, and then also is important for feeding into some parts of this brainstem and medulla, and get some very important types of issues that we'll talk about later. So these types of territories that we have, and that's how they define these perfusion areas that we see within the arterial supply into the brain, is being shown here. Superior cerebellar arterial territories here, and anterior inferior cerebellar arterial territory here, and then the posterior cerebellar arterial territory here. So those are the ones that we're kind of focused on here. But you can also see that we also have some region of the posterior cerebral arterial territory that's kind of tucked in here and more. We'll talk more about those in a little bit, but let's focus in on this. And in particular, I'm interested in this, this region here, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So what this can do is that this can create Wallenberg syndrome. And this kind of loss of input into not only the posterior portions of the cerebellum, but this part right in here of the brainstem, this dorsal part of the, or rather ventral dorsal part of the brainstem here. If we take a cross section and looked at it, we would see these types of shaded areas being blocked or occluded here. And a lot of the nuclei are named here, which we're not going to get into quite yet, but we'll see them come up later. And the main idea is basically that we're looking in Wallenberg syndrome, which is a blockage of this posterior inferior cerebellar artery. We see this loss of these tissues here. And so there's issues that come up with sympathetic feeding into this, like the sympathetic nervous system, the trigeminal nerve here, and some of the different nuclei that are important for feeling. And in addition, the vestibular nuclei here. So when people have Wallenberg syndrome, lesions of the vestibular nuclei are linked to vertigo. And then there's like a hoarseness that starts to arise from damaging some of these cranial nerve areas that are important for controlling the throat. And so the dorsal motor nucleus of this the vagus nerve, which we'll learn about later, is in this region here and gets damaged. So that's one area that gets messed up, that gets disrupted here. And then we end up seeing this kind of limb ataxia and different types of issues that can start to occur as well, because you're starting to damage the cerebellum, which is very important for motor coordination. So those are some of the symptoms that can come up in this in these patients that suffer from this kind of damage. So that's one example of a kind of damage and occlusion that can occur, and helps to illustrate the principle of how these different domains are fed by arteries. So we want to try to remember the different names that these different arteries, and then be able to identify the different regions in which they actually perfuse those areas according to our objectives that we have. So what we're looking at here is basically that we have an occlusion that's occurring. And so this is one that was taken from 2004. I have some more images that I can show you as well, but this is a really dramatic one where we can see this kind of angiogram in which we're actually monitoring, seeing arterial perfusion that feeds up. And so what we're looking and what we're seeing here is that this internal carotid is basically feeding into this type of region, and is not able to actually break up and go into multiple different regions. We'll learn about this middle cerebral artery that helps to feed in here. But there's other regions in which we have this damage and the anterior cerebral artery. And so because it doesn't have this, it's missing. And when it's actually rectified and the blockage is removed, you can see how it can feed in nicely into this particular area and allows that blood flow into the brain. So this middle cerebral artery and anterior cerebral artery that are being affected here is that the anterior cerebral artery goes more medial, weirdly, right in the middle. So we're looking sort of at the back of the person here. And then the middle cerebral artery comes out here and then feeds out more laterally into this domain. So if we go back a slide then, what we're looking at here is that the anterior cerebral artery is actually okay and perfusing. And then this middle cerebral artery has been blocked and is no longer supplying that particular domain. So, I don't know why it's doing that again. So when we want to be able to name these different and identify these different territories that are supplied by these major arteries that feed into the brain, we can see that the anterior cerebral arteries coming up right along that midline area, along and the sort of middle regions of the brain there. And then we have the middle cerebral artery that's feeding into more of the medial areas and the temporal lobe. And then finally, this posterior cerebral artery is going towards more to the back of the brain, the posterior region. So this is the occipital lobe, where we have vision occurring that we learned about. And then here's where we have the middle cerebral artery, which is feeding into that temporal lobe. including areas for audition and so forth. And then we have the anterior cerebral artery. And if we hack away and look through a sagittal perspective right along the midline, we can see this anterior cerebral artery here and these different sorts of territories that are outlined in this medial view of the right hemisphere. So if you block the anterior cerebral artery, then you're going to lose some of this kind of feed into this particular region of the brain here. So we can see these laid out in our diagram that we were using to kind of navigate through here, in which we're seeing that we have the anterior cerebral arteries coming off and branching off here from that circle, cerebral arterial circle that we talked about before. And then we have our middle cerebral artery that's been fed by the internal carotid and slides right in here and starts feeding into that area. So more, you can see it projecting out more medially. And then we have this posterior cerebral artery that's feeding in and going and sort of arching back to feed those occipital lobes and everything in that region of our brain that we have back there. So what we have then is a depiction then of this kind of these things all kind of laid out here. Just a nicer perspective of it that kind of gives you a picture of where this is and links it to our Crossman and Neary book that we have. So, okay, all right, so we've talked about these different regions and these different domains. What we want to be able to do now is to look at just a couple more examples of this lateral view of the blood supply of the brain. The middle meningeal artery is really interesting. It arises from the external carotid. And so I'll go back and I want to just show you where that external carotid was in one of our earlier images. It was actually the very first slide that we were looking at. So here's our brachiocephalic trunk, and then it comes and feeds into the common carotid that feeds into our internal carotid. We've been obsessing on the internal carotid here, and then how it feeds into this cerebral arterial circle. But here's our external, external carotid here. And what we're looking at is we're looking to see how it feeds into some of these different domains here. And one of the ones that we were curious about is the middle meningeal artery. So let's return back to our slide that we have, which is slide number 16. And what we're looking at here is the lateral view of that middle meningeal artery. It wasn't depicted in that first picture, but kind of showed superficial temporal area in that picture. But what we're looking at basically is that we have this kind of the dura mater being supplied by these different meningeal types of arteries here. So we have a front branch and a parietal branch that kind of arises from there. And this is actually meaningful because you can actually hit this region really easily, and it's going to be the source of issues for people who have damage to their brain. So this one area that's important for the proteron is what the region is called here. What you can do is you can basically, if you break and crack into this particular area of this, you're more likely to actually strike and hit that how the middle meningeal artery hits the frontal branch, and that can lead to these epidural hematomas that can ultimately kill people. So that's a region that's important for it. So all right. So then let's kind of come back to looking at these different types of blood supplies that we were talking about for the middle and anterior and posterior cerebral arteries, and think about what's going on in these different depictions. So what we have is these middle cerebral arteries are supplying surface to the lateral surface of each cerebral hemisphere. So if you remember, it's kind of coming up and then kind of going out to more of these areas out in the lateral regions here, and this includes the sensory motor areas mapping to the face and the upper limb. So the face and upper limb regions are down in this area, and the torso and hind legs are kind of back in here. So that central sulcus, and when we're looking at in terms of the feeding into the posterior, or rather the post-central gyrus that supplies the somatosensory cortex, and we're kind of looking at this area here, we see that we have these issues that arise. So what we're looking at then is that this somatotopic representation that we have of our body along the somatosensory cortex gets disrupted, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But the main idea that I want you to kind of walk away with first here is just to see how that middle cerebral artery is feeding into this area, and then how this can link to where we have our limbs and the mapping of our limbs and everything like that, and our postcentral gyrus here, which is here, sorry. And then if we kind of take a look at how this works, this is that depiction that we saw on the previous slide here. And then this is where we actually have mapping of our postcentral gyrus here. So somatosensory cortex is right here, and the motor cortex is right here. And then we can see they kind of overlap each other, and they're kind of nicely aligned. And then what you find is that you start to see damage in these particular types of areas and issues that arise if you block this area of the middle cerebral artery. So there's a watershed area that's also being depicted here. This is where we have branches from the anterior cerebral artery able to help compensate for what is lost out of the posterior cerebral artery. So there's some compensation that can arise, or sort of these areas that can be actually affected by hypoperfusion into one of these different domains, simply because they're not necessarily covered by either one of those very well. So when we look at the somatotopic organization of the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, so here's the motor cortex, area 4 that we're looking at, and this is the somatosensory cortex, and areas 1, 2, 3 that we have. And so what we're looking at is basically how we have this kind of depiction, somatotopic map in our brain. So we have our face regions, like here's the somatosensory region right here, so here's our face, and it would be depicted down towards this region here. And then our fingers would be here, and arm and torso would be kind of up here. So that's mapping onto this picture here that's showing sort of a cutaway of the brain and those different domains depicted there. So what we're also looking at then is the motor cortex and a cross-section there. And the major idea is that that middle cerebral artery, if you cut that off, you're going to see some damage occurring to motor function and sensory function in the cerebral cortex there. So, okay, that's cool. What else comes off of that middle cerebral artery? Well, interestingly, there's also some deep nuclei that are affected by and perfused by the middle cerebral artery. So here we're watching that internal carotid artery snake up and then feed into that middle cerebral artery. That's right here. And then what happens is that we have these striates that arise from the middle cerebral artery. And what they do is that they're basically feeding into the basal ganglia, some of those deep nuclei of the telencephalon that are important for maintaining the perfusion of that area. So here's our coronal section that we have. This is looking at it from the side. Here's that caudate nucleus kind of looping around here. And we see this kind of perfusion and appearance of these arteries into that area. And so damage, you can have sort of like lacunar types of infarcts that occur in these areas and so forth, where you can see some damage that happens in specific regions of the basal ganglia, for example. And so in a cutaway, in a coronal section here, looking at from the front, here's that middle cerebral artery that's feeding into and giving these what they call lenticulostriate types of these arteries that are responsible for perfusing the different regions of the brain. So if you have blockage to these lenticulostriate types of branches here, then what you have is you start to see these deficits that arise from damage to basal ganglia, damage to the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is really important for motor function, as we'll learn about more, and is really critical for being able to function. Damage in Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease, they both have issues with the basal ganglia that have motor functions associated with them. And so in the case of when you have damage to the basal ganglia due to this kind of infarct from the middle cerebral artery or from supplying to these lenticulostriate regions here, you can end up seeing these kinds of occlusions that occur here, and that results in contralateral rigidity, tremor, and weakness. So on the opposite side of the body, where the brain here, this hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body, we see these types of issues that can arise. So, okay, that's the middle cerebral artery. What else do we have to look at? Well, one thing that we can consider is that we can look at this kind of basic map of where we see the anterior cerebral artery come in and feed into that medial part of the brain that we talked about before. So we're looking again at that. We've cut away half the brain and we're looking at it from the side and we're seeing this kind of perfusion that we have in this region here. So anterior cerebral artery is feeding into that domain and is responsible for that. And the posterior cerebral artery we can see in green here. And so, and then it's listed here basically, the medial surface of each cerebral hemisphere, including the sensory motor areas mapped to the hip and the limb, which is back in this region here. The posterior cerebral arteries are important for feeding into the occipital lobes, important for vision. So again, we can see Brodmann's areas being represented. And in this case, what we're talking about is that the anterior cerebral artery would affect these regions here or these regions here. So, okay, that's the anterior cerebral artery. What about that posterior cerebral artery? In this perspective, we're looking up at the brain. Here we can see the posterior cerebral artery being responsible for feeding into this particular region here. And what we're watching basically is how we have these different domains distorted. Sorry, oops. I have with me. And then what we're watching then is that we have these domains that can be distorted. So this is part of the thalamus that then gives rise to what is known as the optic radiations that feed into and carry visual input into the occipital lobes here. So visual input comes in that crosses the optic chiasm, feeds into the thalamus and the specific nuclei as a lateral geniculate nucleus that then ultimately then synapses and sends back fibers back to the occipital lobe. And so this kind of train and chain of inputs here can get disrupted. Takeaway, we do our visual processing here. We get a lot of feeding into it. Anything that breaks up that kind of communication going from the retina back to the back of the brain is trouble. And that posterior cerebral artery is really important for helping to feed into this particular area here. Now there's some coverage. We have this middle cerebral artery that's coming in here, but this region back in here is really important for maintaining our ability to be able to process that information. And so if we lose, like let's say we lose this portion of our visual field, or rather we lose this portion of the occipital lobe, we can lose half of our visual field, our ability to process one half of our visual field. And so they call this homonymous heminopsia. And so basically it kind of looks like this, where you lose half of your visual field and it appears in both eyes, you would have this kind of an issue arising. So, and that would be because you've kind of lost half of your ability to process this back area, or to process your visual field because you've blocked off the occipital lobes and the visual cortex's perfusion into that area, so it's shut down. So, talking about the venous system then, and what we're looking at here, what we see is that we have lots of feeding into, from like here's the superior sagittal sinus here, we have these deep cerebral veins here that are carrying in information, or rather venous supply. We have the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein. All of these are kind of draining back and carrying it from high pressure to low pressure and heading back to our superior vena cava and ultimately back to the right atrium of the heart. And so to kind of pull apart some of these different domains that we're looking at here, if we're looking at this medial view here, where we've taken away the brain and we're just looking at these different depictions and dural folds that we have in the brain, what we can see is that we have the superior sagittal sinus right up along in here. We have a transverse sinus. We can kind of see it kind of tucking back there, and then coming out of the plane of the page would be right here. We also have this inferior sagittal sinus that's present right here. And all of these different dural folds, they kind of run right along with them, and are responsible for being able to, and they're present within this sort of longitudinal fissure that we can see from the top here. And so these are responsible for helping to drain them. So superior and inferior sagittal sinus is what we want to be able to appreciate here And then what we're looking at is that transverse sinus. And so if we look at a depiction of, here's that dural fold again, and then the superior sagittal sinus is here, transverse here, inferior sagittal sinus is right here. Let's just take a look, color these in. Again, that's the superior sagittal sinus that we see that's going, that's moving back there. Inferior sagittal sinus right along in there. And then let's see, it's not doing anything. There we go. All right. And so, and then what were these internal cerebral veins that are coming in and taking in some of that blood flow as well. We're also having a little bit of influx coming in from that basal vein here that's feeding in here, but the internal cerebral vein is the one I wanted to kind of point out to you. And then we have this straight sinus that's helping to connect the two regions here and helping to feed into this transverse vein right here, and this transverse sinus, as they call it here. And then that ultimately then feeding back in down to the sigmoid sinus and ultimately into the inferior vena cava. So, okay. So that's how we have sort of venous draining from those different domains. And we've talked about, and when we were talking about the meningeal system, we had this idea of talking about how the cerebral spinal fluid was moving through these different spaces of the brain, how it's kind of arising from the lateral ventricles here and then moving through these different third and fourth ventricles and then sort of washing up over the brain here and then feeding out. And then we talked about these arachnoid villi and how the CSF is leaving here. And then it feeds into that superior sagittal sinus. And so the takeaway, or something that I think is kind of important to think about, is that, yeah, okay, we have the CSF that's kind of moving around here. And that, and think about when you kind of recall your physiology, and that was basically that we're looking at how blood flows from high pressure to low pressure. The same thing is true for other types of fluids here. So CSF is moving from high pressure, whereas being supplied in lateral ventricle by the arterial type of system and moving along and moving through these different areas, and then feeding into these arachnoid villi that then dump into this relatively low pressure superior sagittal sinus. So this helps kind of keep things moving along as it goes. So so that covers much of these different types of domains of the brain in these different regions. I've kind of added a couple of slides to help you see some of these different images, but that's the heart of it. So the heart of it. So go back, take a look, go through this as you're walking through this. I have added some slides here, and I'll put them online as well for you to check out. But I think this will help you get sort of the idea of how significant this is. For test questions, because I know that's a key thing when you're thinking about strategizing your studying, is those slides that I've already just covered. You can use that and then the objectives to kind of go through those different issues and try to work them out. But I want to show you a couple of things that help relate it to stroke that I think is kind of important. So one thing is that we were talking about these different areas that can be perfused by the anterior, posterior, middle cerebral arteries, middle, anterior, and posterior regions of these different arteries here. And we're looking at a perspective of the brain here being perfused by these different areas. And again, like I said, you're not going to be tested on these things, but it's just, I think, really an interesting way to see how these kind of feed into it. And so this posterior type of circulation is being depicted here, and then this sort of the domains that are being, in terms of the right and left anterior middle cerebral arteries are being shown with the green and red blocks there. And what that does is that it allows people to be able to visualize and track what kinds of perfusion territories are actually happening in different patients that have these types of issues. And so this is a patient that has a lacunar type of infarction, likely due to some kind of occlusion of one of the lenticular striate types of arteries or something. But you can see that normally what you'd find is that there would be this nice kind of, it would look the same on both sides, but you can see there's a spot of white here that's come up in this weighted MRI image. And so that is indicative of an infarction that's occurred there. But you can see that the perfusion of these different, the left and the right side and this posterior portion here are well covered in this individual. But if you have it, but these perfusion territories can be shifted, so there can be some compensation that can start to happen that helps to be to occur. But if you have a blockage of the inferior cerebral artery, this can lead to infarctions occurring. In this case, in the anterior portions of the brain that's being depicted here. And so we're having it so that the patient's right side or left side here is being damaged, but then that the right side is sort of able to perfuse in some of this area here when they're trying to track it out. So there's some kind of coverage that can happen and compensation that can occur in these different types of issues. And then if you block this vertebral basilar, if you remember that sort of posterior type of perfusion that's coming up from the back and fed from the vertebral system into the basilar artery, etc., and you kind of cut that region off, then that's going to cut off this back area of the brain from being fed as well. And so there's an infarction that's occurred in that particular region. And what's dramatic in this case is if you actually look at what the patient's perfusion really looks like, they should be in much more danger than that. But you can see that there's no blue in here, unlike what you saw in earlier depictions in the normal case, where you see this nice kind of patch that's fed by this vertebral basilar types of posterior circulation that's occurring. So those are kind of cool examples that happen there. I'm going to show you some other ones just for good measure here, where we're looking at the MCA, or middle cerebral artery occlusions that can occur. This is another depiction of those lenticular striate arteries that I was describing that feed into the basal ganglia here. But the cool part about it is that if you have a blockage in the MCA, then you can see these types of infarctions that can arise here. So this is one that's occurred here, and there's a filling in of some of that area that's occurred with a hemorrhage. So this is hemorrhagic, and it's actually, this is the patient's left ventricular space here. You should see it over here, but it's filled with blood. So not a good situation. And another depiction of these types of occlusions can be more dramatic here in the middle cerebral artery. So, I was saying, oh yeah, you're going to lose your ability to see, or with the middle cerebral arteries, you lose some of the function in motor and sensory function in your face and in your upper body because of where it's happening. But I think what's really dramatic in these types of images also is just seeing how these middle cerebral occlusions that can occur, that can happen very deeply inside of areas of the brain here. And this is kind of moving up from very lower, upper, and kind of moving up through the brain, moving progressively upwards from where we see it here. And so this occlusion is causing an infarction here, all the way through. And we're seeing it very deep inside of the brain here. And then we're also seeing it in some of the surface areas as well, where that middle cerebral artery is really important for that type of damage there. And so this is these are these are issues that can come up. But the MCA types of occlusions that can happen can be a lot smaller as well. You can see some of these here. In this case, it's bilateral that's occurred, and so you can this is another type of damage that can happen in these different types of arteries. So okay. Another thing that's come up that's really kind of interesting is talking about watersheds. I showed you that image of these different watersheds and how it helps depict the boundary between these two different types of arterial vascularization. But this is actually really interesting in terms of showing how we have these different types of domains and how they can be affected by hypoperfusion within these different areas. So there's a cortical border zone, an internal border zone, another cortical border zone here, in which we have these different areas. Here's a posterior cerebral artery feeding into that back area, I think occipital lobe, and that area we were talking about before. Here's our middle cerebral artery that's feeding into this area, anterior cerebral artery that's feeding into this area. And so these cortical border zones can be susceptible to hypoperfusion that could occur in those different domains. So we can see this kind of thing happen in this example here, this watershed area here, where we've had a blockage of the inferior cerebral artery in the right inferior cerebral artery. So patient's right here. We see that kind of infarction that's occurred there. And it's right along that watershed between these different domains. So in this type of area here, between the ACA and the MCA. So the internal carotid artery helps to supply those two different domains. And so if you have an occlusion of it, not necessarily that you've blocked it completely, but maybe you've cut it back a lot, you can make these regions very susceptible to damage if they aren't getting adequate perfusion in those two different areas. In the venous side of things, when we're looking at drainage, there's even issues here that are really kind of interesting. So cortical veins feeding into that superior sagittal sinus, and then there's others that are feeding the cavernous sinus and some of those areas that we didn't quite describe as much. We did talk about the internal cerebral veins here being supplying those types of areas. But the cool part is looking at, much like we saw with the carotid artery and the blockage there, you can also have damage and thrombosis that occurs in these different types of veins here. So think deep vein thrombosis and what they tell you to worry about when you get on a plane and those types of issues here. Well, the thromboid event that's occurred is in this particular region of the brain here. And what we see is that there's this sagittal sinus that's kind of draining back here, then feeds into this transverse sinus that's ultimately feeding into the sigmoid sinus. We're kind of looking at the top and then seeing how it kind of drains back and then tucks down and it's going to feed back into it. And we're missing this side. So, and that's because there's been a clot. So that's the kind of issue that's happened in this case. Here, there's two of those different domains here that have caused the entire temporal lobe in this particular type of example to have an infarct that's occurred in that case. So you can have these deep cerebral veins that are important for carrying back that information, that blood flow. And this is kind of cool to see how you can see there's light damage that's occurring in these areas in the basal ganglia regions here that are, when they're not being supplied with, or not having the ability to actually clear out their blood flow as they normally would. All right, so I just wanted to kind of show you some of those examples, but again, I'm going to reiterate it's that first set of slides that we're going to focus on for answering some of our objectives. Thanks so much, and good luck.